Last week, we went back into history, and it was kind of a difficult class for me to teach because I'm not an historian, but we went back into history and we heard about the strong group culture of the Roman Empire and also that general Mediterranean region in the time of Jesus. We also heard some quotes from people of the 2nd to the 4th centuries AD regarding the working of the strong group in that culture and in later centuries as well, and that the idea of the strong group was active and well even into the 15th century, because we got a quote from that century as well. Now, as far as New Testament times go, I settled on these principles regarding the strong group culture. There are two main ones, and then there are three corollaries. Ancient Mediterranean societies revolved around the strong group culture. That was just part of who they were. That was part of the culture. The idea that the needs of the group outweigh the needs of the individual. Allegiance was to the group, not to the self, not to the individual. Secondly, although people of that day usually belonged to several groups, and we enumerated some of the groups, there was family, there might have been a work group, there were maybe a group at the synagogue you were a part of, or maybe your neighborhood if you lived in an urban area. There were several groups, even like there are today. Each one of you is a member of one and probably more groups of some kind, groups of people. In religious terms, we can liken it maybe to a small group or a life group that some of us have or still do participate in. And then there are other groups at work, groups maybe with your kids and the neighbor kids, or groups of families in one neighborhood. Maybe you live kind of on a cul-de-sac, and there are 3 or 4 neighbors that are all kind of members of a group, that kind of thing. But although people of that day usually belonged to several groups, the group that commanded the primary allegiance was the family group, the blood family group, and of that blood family group, it was brothers and sisters, it was siblings. That was primary over all. In the New Testament world, the group took priority over the individual. In the New Testament world, a person's most important group was his blood family. And in the New Testament world, the closest family bond was not marriage, believe it or not, it was the sibling bond. And along with those are these corollaries. There are 2 of them. The central value that characterized ancient family relationships was the obligation to absolute loyalty to one's blood siblings. Absolute loyalty. Second, the most treacherous disloyalty was not disloyalty to a spouse, but rather betrayal of a sibling. That's how they worked, and that's how they thought, and that's how that culture was back in that day. Now, in these next 30 or so minutes, we're going to come to see that Jesus enters into this kind of a society. The strong group society, and the understanding of the idea of the strong group and the bond between and among siblings, Jesus understood that. He was part of that society. Jesus, in his ministry, works to move that primary allegiance away from blood siblings or the family group and toward the disciples or followers of Jesus. That's part of his ministry, is to get people to move that allegiance from their siblings and their family over to the family of disciples or the family of believers, the family of followers, and to make that group the primary allegiance of that person. Now, to do this, he often brings up the idea of his followers being a family, with them all being brothers and sisters of one another. He doesn't say you're all one family and there are mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles. He says you're all brothers and sisters of one another. Now, if this idea catches on, it would then follow that his followers would carry the idea of absolute loyalty to siblings into this group of disciples and later on into the church. Can you also begin to see why Jesus is considered to be our older brother in terms of absolute loyalty to siblings? Well, to begin, I'm going to quote a scholarly work by Bruce Malina, I think that's his last name, M-A-L-I-N-A, called Christian Origins and Cultural Anthropology. And I'm not going to do a lot of quoting today, but I'll do some. I'll do some Bible quoting. This, he says, is what New Testament ancient Christians would have conceived of regarding his relationship to the church. Now, the quote is not exact. I've shortened it. I made it a little more readable. He uses all kinds of formal PhD language. Sorry, Julie. He uses all kinds of formal PhD language, and I had to kind of retranslate so I could understand it. This is what he says in general terms. I am a member of the church. I am responsible to the church for my actions. This is what a follower back then would have said. I'm a member of the church. I'm responsible to the church for my actions, my career, my personal development, and for life in general. I'm free to do what feels right only if that doing is in accordance with church norms and is in the best interests of the church. He says that's what a believer in New Testament times, that's the principle that he would have had in his head regarding his or her relationship with the church family. Isn't that interesting? I thought it was. Certainly that's not how a lot of us think today. The church as a group, a fellowship, and I'm not speaking about this congregation, I've told you that before, in particular necessarily, the church in general when I say that. The church as a group, a fellowship, is largely absent from our thought process in everyday life. Some of us who relish our freedom find that statement even off-putting. We don't like it. I'm responsible to the church for my actions, my career, my personal development, for life in general. How many of you consulted the church before deciding on a career? We got another Pharisee over there. And I think one behind, too. But really, how often, we just didn't do that. Personal development, life in general, we're responsible to the church. I'm free to do whatever as long as it's in the best interest of myself? No, as long as it's in the best interest of the church.
Jay?
Ma'am?
Just because we didn't go to the elders and say, is it okay if I do this, doesn't mean we didn't think about that in our mind and ask or pray to the Lord, what is the best thing for me to do?
Yeah, I agree, Diane. If you are a Christian, if you are a follower of Christ, you will wrap that truth into any decision, or you should anyway, wrap that truth into any decision you make. You wouldn't necessarily have gone before the elders, the church, whatever, and said, is it okay if I do this? Curtis raised his hand. I almost hesitate to ask him what his process was, but I think I'm going to. Did you actually go to elders or talk with people or?
No, not really. I think probably when a youth minister was the first one that I ever approached about, hey, I think I might like to do this, and didn't know what to do exactly. And it was a lot of, I would say informal or what seemed like random, probably more providential things that just dropped into place at the right time, right place, and so on and so forth. So it was intertwined with people in the church, but I never went asking for, certainly not authority or.
And I don't know how they would have done that back then. I don't have any idea. You raised your hand too.
Yeah, I did. Before we started working in a children's home, the one we were at in Cincinnati, Aaron was a minister for 20-plus years. And so we actually worked with the children's home through our congregation. But when we felt that we needed to change our path, we actually went back to our home congregation and asked them about the decision we were considering, what they thought, to pray about it, to give advice. We actually went before the
Okay.
congregation and asked
Okay.
to change careers, because it was a total, in some ways, change.
Okay. Which, at least in my mind anyway, Denise, is more like what I think happened here. I don't know that because I don't have any specifics in terms of exactly how they did that back then. But in my mind, that's kind of what if you didn't go before the entire church body, maybe you would have asked people that you trusted, were closer to, that kind of thing. I don't know. For the early Christian, the church was not just an institution or a nonprofit corporation. The church wasn't something that they did a couple of hours a week in a particular location. The church was a living and breathing organism on a mission, and they were part of that living organism. And maybe in general, we need to begin to think of the church today more organically than we currently do. You've heard me say before in other classes, if you've been in some of my other classes, that when the topic came up, that for many of the Jews of that day, their religion was their life and their life was their religion. They were so intertwined that they could not be separated. Everything they said, everything they did, everything they thought from the time they got up until they went to sleep at night was first passed through the worldview of the Old Testament law and prophets. They brought that organic process to the New Testament church when they became Christians. Second, the church family would have to be healthy to avoid a cult-like mentality. These are some caveats to this idea that we do what we want or what seems good as long as the church okays it. Church family would have to be healthy to avoid a cult-like mentality. That would mean that authority was shared by several qualified individuals who have a servant mentality, not a single individual with a controlling mentality. And if you stop and think about it, God's plan for shepherds, when carried out as He desires, kind of fulfills that. And three, each individual would have to willingly commit to the church on an individual level. Coercion or forced allegiance was not a part of that equation. Such a commitment should be on the basis of truth, not warped ideology, and should be made willingly and without reservation. And so you should have to want to be a part of the church family. Okay, let's carry these thoughts into Jesus' teachings and His ministry. Joseph Hellerman wrote one of the books that I'm working with besides the Bible. In his book tells this story to introduce his readers to the words of Jesus as they have to do with a strong group culture. I like this analogy. You may want to have some comment on this, I don't know. And again, I've edited this story to condense it somewhat and to make it a little more easily understood. Here's what he said in this book. He says, as a pastor, I get involved with people who have lost loved ones, both young and old. I help families plan funerals for people that they dearly love and cherish. I've also helped families who are the surviving members of a family that has experienced violence or sudden illness and death. Surviving family members confront a torrent of deep and conflicting emotions as they experience both personal loss as well as a sense of their own mortality in the face of death. Now, to me, this presents great opportunities for ministry and demands a degree of sensitivity that is normally not required in my daily work. I must carefully consider the impact of my words in these kinds of situations. Right, Curtis? Something I would never say, he says, ever, to a person who had just lost for example, his father, and who came to me seeking support and counsel in order to plan an appropriate funeral and memorial service would be, well, forget planning the funeral. We need to go on a mission trip. Let the other relatives make the arrangements and attend the service. Let them bury their dead. That would be something I would never say to anyone in that situation, and neither would you. Those of you that know some of the New Testament know exactly what story that comes from. Okay, this is me again. Even though we would never say such a thing, Jesus essentially did in Luke chapter 9 this conversation. As they, that is, Jesus and the disciples, were walking along the road, someone said to Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Then he said to another man, "Follow me." And the man replied, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Let the dead bury their own dead. You, however, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." So what's going on here? What do you think, what are your thoughts about what Hellerman said with his story and what Jesus said that Luke tells? Are they similar? At least somewhat? Why would Jesus say such a thing? Comments?
Did he do that to see what was more important to him? Was it Jesus or his brothers? He didn't know he was gone.
Yeah, I think what you said, Angela, is that Jesus was looking at what was actually more important to this man. Was it more important to be a follower of Jesus and proclaim the coming of the kingdom, or was it more important to go bury his father? And the answer, of course, would be to go with Jesus, but that doesn't compute in my mind.
If Jesus told me that, I would go.
If Jesus told me that, she says, I would go. I don't know if the man ever went or not. Any other comments?
Felt like Jesus had the ability to, this down, to see a person's heart. And so he would have been able to identify whether that was an excuse or not. We don't have that ability, but, so that could be that in that case, Jesus could see that his excuse of wanting to go bury his father was just that, putting off actually following him.
It sounds to me like the man was willing to go with him a little later.
And he was very caring, he's very caring. He wants to know if he really wants to go or not.
He's trying to determine whether he really wants to go or not. Can you stop and think about this? We don't know what happened to this man, but if this man turned back around and followed Jesus right then, did not go back to his home or whatever, can you imagine the impact that had on his family? Maybe his mother, who was still alive. Well, no, Mother, I can't come to the funeral. I can't help plan the funeral because I'm going to follow this itinerant preacher. So there's more at stake here than just whether this man said yes or no.
I think it's been a while since I've looked at this story, but I think I remember right. We're often thinking about how burial practices in our own time works, and it's vastly different.
Yeah.
So it's not as if he would have come to us and said, "I know your funeral's dad is on Saturday, but we got to go." Okay, it's not that sort of thing. It's more of the time of grieving is passed, and now he is to manage the family inheritance on behalf of his father. I think that's probably
Yeah.
a little more, so it's still a sting, but it takes a little of the sting out. It's not quite so insensitive.
There are other matters involved
Yeah,
here
I think
besides
so.
just burying somebody.
Yeah, I think so.
Or putting them in a tomb.
I think he's
or whatever.
inviting him to come and live for the kingdom rather than being so concerned about the administration of the family business, maybe.
Jesus here, according to Hellerman, is beginning the process of moving his disciples from the strong group blood family mentality over to the idea of the strong group Jesus follower family, which soon is going to be the church. Jesus is here and in other places in Scripture telling his followers that it is those followers, those who leave all to follow Jesus, who are now their brothers and sisters and family. These are the primary family in their life, and he's starting to say that now. Okay, let's look up some other passages where Jesus emphasizes the primacy of the Jesus follower family. Now notice here, he's not saying that the blood family has no importance. He's not saying disown your family. He's not saying you don't have a brother or sister anymore. He's not saying that. But he's working to move primary allegiance, and that word primary is very important. He's working to move primary allegiance over to a person's disciple family. But his words are radical, to say the least, in that day and in this. Matthew chapter 10. Do not assume that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Matthew chapter 10, I don't have the actual verses. Okay. And in Mark chapter 3, and I don't have the verses for this either, Mark chapter 3, Jesus' mother and brother come and stand outside the place where Jesus is, and they sent someone in to summon him, and a crowd was sitting around him. Look, he was told, your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you. Jesus replied, who are my mother? Who are my brothers? And in looking at those seated in a circle around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. He didn't disown his mother. He didn't disown his brothers. But he said, you people, you really are my brothers and sisters. And I know he didn't disown his mother because when he was hanging on the cross, he gave the care of his mother to John. And she accepted that, and John accepted that. So he didn't disown his mother. These words in New Testament times, and I think as well as in our time, I have the word here, revolutionary. In the modern day, we tend to sanitize these words when we look at them. We tend to sanitize them to make them fit a little better our notion of what family and church ought to be, and I speak here in general again. We insert a lot of ifs, ands, and buts into any explanation of these passages that we attempt. Jesus didn't mince words. Jesus knew exactly what he was saying, and he also knew how these words would be taken in his day as well as in our day. For example, in the last passage, when Jesus' mother and brothers come to see him and Jesus rebuffs them in public, Jesus was also rebuffing the tradition of the oldest son being kind of responsible for the family honor and care. He, in essence, was disavowing the primacy of his relationship to his family, the primacy of his relationship, and particularly his siblings in favor of his family of disciples. Again, he didn't disown his family, but he moved the primary allegiance from his brothers and sisters over to his disciples, and he's asking these people to do the same thing. We can look at other passages in the New Testament that have that same kind of thinking. The idea of the primacy of our relationship with Jesus, even at the expense, if necessary, of our relationship with family or blood kin. One such passage is the call of Peter, Andrew, James, and John, in which, if you remember, the men left their nets, left their father, left their livelihood, to immediately, as far as we can tell, become Christ followers. Now, to abandon one's father in such a situation as that was in that society tantamount to exchanging one family for another, and really was a betrayal of blood family and parents. They didn't disavow their family, but they apparently immediately recognized that this itinerant preacher had something that they needed and wanted, to the point that they immediately left their nets, their jobs, their livelihood, their father, left him with all of that, and went with this man. Mark chapter 3, we've already looked at that. Jesus, in essence, renounces the primacy of his blood family ties in favor of his spiritual follower family, which he also asked Peter, James, Andrew, and John to do. So he's asking more now of his followers. These people probably had been following him for a while. Peter, Andrew, James, and John probably knew who this guy was anyway. And now he's beginning to press a little harder, I guess. Say, okay, if you really are going to follow me, this is what you need to do. Luke has a particularly difficult saying of Jesus. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Luke 14:26. Okay, we tend to sanitize this by saying that the word for hate merely means to love less. The word for hate merely means to love less. In actuality, the root of the word, according to recent scholarship, means neither of those. It doesn't mean to love less, and it doesn't mean to hate. Rather, the meaning is more of to leave aside or to abandon. To leave aside or to abandon. Peter, Andrew, James, and John essentially abandoned their father. They essentially left aside their careers. Now, I don't know why translations translate that as hate, but it doesn't mean that, but it doesn't mean love less either. The root of that Greek word for hate in the above passage is also found in passages like Mark 8:35. Jesus says, whoever would lose his own life will save it. And that root word there is losing his own life. That's what that's in reference to. The passages where Jesus calls us to deny ourselves, that's where that word's used. It's also telling that the disciples did not totally abandon their families. Peter maintained a wife, maintained a family during his time as an apostle. As I said before, Jesus entrusted his mother to John at his crucifixion, something an oldest son would do. John accepted that responsibility. Maybe there are other places you can think of where that kind of thing took place. So in summary here, what we're seeing here is not a change in the strong family concept, but rather a change in which the family is to be the preeminent family, family is to be the preeminent family in the life of the follower of Jesus, church family. The strong family concept is as valid as ever in Jesus' teachings, but the blood family, and specifically one's siblings, is being replaced by Jesus with the family of followers and disciples' comments.
Isn't Jesus really establishing his exceptionalism. In other words, it's sort of like somebody splashing water in your face or slapping you or something, say, think about this, you know, what she said about burying your father. If Jesus told me that and I knew it was Jesus, I think I would have less problem going ahead and doing that than if somebody that even I respected did it, but I considered them my peer. But he
If
is-
Jesus told you that, Mike, you'd do it. If Curtis told you that, you'd,
Right.
Come on, Mike, come on.
No offense.
Right.
But I really think he is establishing himself as you have now something more important to think about than your family.
I don't know what Peter, Andrew, James, and John, I don't know what the man who he said, let the dead bury their dead, I don't know what their perception of Jesus was at the time. I don't know if they just thought he was a rabbi or an itinerant preacher. I don't know if they'd seen any miracles yet. I mean, I don't know any of that. That would probably have helped also. If we would have seen somebody who couldn't walk for 50 years all of a sudden be able to get up and walk, or some such thing like that, because Jesus did that, that might make a difference. Or if they had been part of the feeding of the 5,000, or I don't know, some other thing. But I agree, Mike, somehow or another, even at this stage, Jesus has some kind of aura, I guess.
Some people, you kind of know.
Yeah.
Whoever's telling you the truth.
Yeah, you just, and on the one hand, you might say, well, this guy's really full of himself. I am the resurrection. I am the life. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the bread of life. Now, I don't know that he said that to these people before this, but you think, well, this guy might be really full of himself, or the guy's telling the truth. At least Jesus believed he was telling the truth. We believe he was telling the truth. And evidently there were a lot of people, at least at this stage in his ministry, who believed that as well. At the end, when it came to the crucifixion, there weren't many people around anymore. Yes, sir.
I remember one of the most jarring things I remember reading was in C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, which is a book about people getting, people of hell getting to visit heaven to see if their relatives or somebody else can convince them to let go of whatever it is that they love so much that's keeping them in hell. And one of the most jarring passages in there is a mother who loves her son to the point of obsession. And she fusses over him and all this kind of stuff, and it ends up being such a love that it blocks her because she loves her son more than she loves God, and it becomes obsessive in her. And you kind of read that, and at first, if you were to say, could that happen? There's no way. And then you kind of read it and like, okay, I actually can see it. But it's the higher the loves, the more noble the loves, the worse the perversion whenever it gets twisted. And I think even as such a high thing as love for family, if it's out of proportion and not subjected to love of God first, it gets out of whack. And I think that's really what he's getting at here, is that in everything, the love of God has to order every other love. And if that's not first, if it somehow gets your love for family somehow gets a love for God, it's going to corrupt it and corrupts everything underneath it. And I always go back to that when I think about when Jesus demands our love for him over our love for family. That story always stuck out to me, that picture of a mother who loved her son to the point of obsession, and it ruined it and ruined her.
Yeah.
And it's a vivid story.
Is it a little different? I don't know. We have, my family is, well, actually, we've been meeting all weekend. All of my brothers and sisters are here, and their spouses and nieces, nephews, and grandkids, and whatever. And we met Friday night. We had Saturday lunch. We had hot dogs Saturday night. We are going to have Sunday lunch together as well, and they'll be leaving Sunday to this afternoon. I mean, I have a great family, and I have great in-laws. For someone who does not have that kind of family, how is your thinking different if you don't have that kind of a blood family? How is your thinking different regarding this and what Curtis said just a moment or two ago? Would it be easier, I see you, Julie, would it be easier for you to have a primary love for God's family if you didn't have a blood family that was loving and faithful and whatever, or is it still difficult?
I think you might think that it would be easier. I don't have siblings. My parents are gone. Don't have children. So I have made my family be part of different groups. And this is my family.
Okay.
I've had family where I worked. I've had family with my friends. So you would think it would be easier for me to say, okay, I can give my full allegiance to the Lord and follow him. And I wish I could do that easily. But I still, look at parts of my families who are not maybe Christ followers, and I love them to some extent. So I'd like it to be easy. It's not always.
It's not necessarily easier. And as someone who doesn't have that, I don't have a clue. I just offhand, I would think, well, it'd be easier just to adopt your church family. But what you're saying is that it's not necessarily that way. Does your experience with your family color your relationship with the church family then?
Oh, yeah. My real my blood family were not particularly church followers. So it was easy for me to become a part of a church family because I felt the love and the nurturing
Okay.
that came there. Not that I didn't feel it for my parents and other members of my family, but it was very different.
I guess what I was asking was something, the only word that comes to my mind is, if you don't have an intimacy with your blood family, is it difficult to create an intimacy with a church family or with any other one? I don't know. Linda?
Well, I mentioned last week, but I think in other countries where Christianity is not the primary religion, and we've got missionaries that are converting people, they do give up their family, their birth family.
Yeah.
And that is hard. I can't compare to that because I don't have that experience.
The Cambodia mission we support or help support is a prime example of that. We get that regularly in Julie's reports.
And their families disown them
Yeah.
when they become Christ followers. So some of this pertains to that. We're in a little different culture.
Yeah, we are.
So there, the church family has to take the place of the blood family, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, Ann. The church family, and you used the word "has to," and I think that's appropriate. The church family has to step in. I don't think the church family has a choice in that matter, because that would be the only family, somebody maybe at the Cambodia mission, that would be the only family they would have. There would be nobody else.
I think that's actually why the book of Hebrews was written, is because you have Christians who have lost their now Jewish family and are being persecuted by that family to the point of where they're tempted to give it up and say, this is too much, I'm just going to go back, And the whole book is calling them to hang tight, and when you think about how hard that would be to not only turn against, people that you might think are pagans, that would be one thing, but to turn against people who were your blood family over the difference of Christ, boy, that's costly in that situation.
Yeah, I cannot imagine having to perhaps turn aside my blood family or even my in-laws for the sake of someone else or some other family. I just can't imagine that.
Jay, as I even think of this in relation to even what Curtis is talking about on Sunday mornings, the first will be last, the last will be first. This flipped, this new and different way of doing things. I think about historically how their families were everything. I mean, we have lists of, Lemuel who begat Noah, who begat, and the lineage being so important for so long, even with their tribes, the tribes of Israel, that kind of binding was everything. And so this new way of maybe looking at family as being grafted in is a new concept for them and also for us.
What she was saying, if you couldn't quite hear, hopefully I can summarize in a sentence or two, is that for the Jewish people back then, their blood families, I mean their lineage, they could trace their lineage all the way from Jacob's kids. I'm sorry, yeah, all the way from Jacob. I was thinking Levi and Judah and all of those. They could trace their lineage all the way back, and they knew who begat whom and all of that kind of thing, and to take the primacy of that into the church family would have been a Herculean task for many. I think that sort of adequately. Any other comments, and we'll close.
I think similar thoughts of how hard would it be. I just can't relate to letting go of my family because we don't have that persecution here. But recently I've gotten to know a group of Iranians who have been baptized this summer. And so they can't go back as Christians and without being persecuted or killed. But on the flip side, it just shows me they have so much excitement for Christ because of the freedom he offers that they don't have in their culture. And so while I think how awful to be persecuted, how wonderful to feel that freedom. And it's just a testament to me of how Christ calls us to that, not because it's hard, but because it's freedom and it's joy, and it's just a testament to me.
And while you were talking, I was thinking, maybe we who have it easy in terms of, being baptized, maintaining, becoming Christians, maintaining our families and so on, maybe we need to be just a little bit jealous of these people for having this sense of newfound freedom and all of that they enjoy. Some of us have not had the opportunity to experience that, and we look at them and we feel sorry for them in a way, but in another way, sometimes maybe we should wish or think that might have been good to have had that kind of an experience. I don't know which I would rather have had. Anything else? All right. To end this part of the discussion, I'm going to quote Hellerman again. Jesus and his followers did not define loyalty to God solely in terms of an individualistic personal relationship with Jesus, nor did they define it as loyalty to the church as an institution. Loyalty to God for the early Christian found its tangible daily expression in unswerving loyalty to God's group, the family of surrogate siblings who called him Father. People in the Mediterranean antiquity had to leave one family in order to join another. If we're truly serious about returning to our biblical roots, where our relationships with our fellow human beings are concerned, our priority list should look something like this. First, God's family. Second, my family. Third, others. These priorities fairly reflect the way in which the early Christians viewed life together in their local church communities. Next week, we are going to come into the modern day. We're going to look at the church again in general, as we believe it is, and what we may want to look at in terms of how do we need to make this more like what we find in the New Testament regarding the church family and how that family operated. And the title of next week's lesson, I don't always have titles, but the title of next week's lesson is Let's Go Out of Business. And what I'm going to talk about for the next week or two is the fact that the church model of today, in many cases, is a business model. It's a business model. And I think you would probably already grasp several of the concepts, Steve, in terms of what that's like, and some others as well. And maybe we need to kind of rethink that kind of thing. Not necessarily that we need to get rid of our nonprofit status and whatever, because there's some things you have to do in the modern day, in the modern society, to satisfy government and so on. But in terms of how we think and how we operate and how we think about church. Let's go out of business. We'll bring it up to the modern day. Thank you. You're dismissed.